The Fall of Númenor, an epic tale. In the days when the world was young and the great music had but lately shaped the foundations of Arda, there rose from the depths of Beligire a mighty island, wrought in the shape of a five-pointed star. This was Númenor, the Westernesse, gift of the valor to the Edain, who had fought valiantly against the shadow in the elder days. Upon the central mountain of Meneltarma, the pillar of heaven, the first king Elros Tar Miniatur raised his throne, and from thence his line would rule for 3,000 years. The Númenorians grew in wisdom and stature, their ships sailing to the uttermost ends of the great sea, their craftsmen surpassing even the Eldar in skill of hand and keenness of mind. Yet in the harbors of Romena, where the great ships lay at anchor like sleeping swans, there came whispers from the eastern shore. Mariners spoke of a growing darkness in Middle-earth, of a shadow that stirred in the land of Mordor. The wise among them remembered the warnings of Gil-galad, the elven king, who had sent word that Sauron the Deceiver walked again in fair form among the men of Middle-earth. In the palace of Armenelos, King Ar-Pharazôn the Golden heard these tidings with a furrowed brow. Tall he was and mighty, with the light of Númenor bright in his eyes, yet pride had begun to take root in his heart, like a poisonous weed. "What is this Sauron to us?" he declared to his council. "Are we not the mightiest, the children of Ilúvatar? Do not our ships command all the sea, and our armies make the very earth tremble?" But in the tower of Armenelos, the seeing stone of the west flickered with visions of fire and shadow, and the keeper of the Palantir, one Arandur the Farseer, beheld troubling dream. In them he saw great waves rolling over the mountains of Númenor, and the Meneltarma itself broken and cast down into the abyss. The seasons turned, and with each passing year, the ships of Númenor sailed further eastward, their holds filled with the wealth of distant land. Yet it was not gold or jewels that Ar-Pharazôn sought, but dominion over all the shores of Middle-earth. His armies had grown beyond counting, his fleets darkened the very seas, and his name was spoken in whispers from the grey havens to the bay of Belfalas. In the port of Umbar, which the Númenorians had built as a mighty fortress, there came word that troubled the king's heart. Messengers spoke of Sauron's growing power, of how he had taken the title of King of Men and Lord of the earth. This news kindled wrath in Ar-Pharazôn's breast, for he deemed himself the rightful lord of all mortal land. "Ready my ships," commanded the king. "We sail to Middle-earth, and this upstart shall bow before the might of Númenor, or be cast down into darkness." The preparation was like nothing seen since the days of the War of Wrath. The harbors of Romena groaned under the weight of countless vessels, their masts rising like a forest of spears. The army that assembled was beyond the reckoning of mortal mind, clad in steel that shone like stars and bearing banners that snapped in the western wind. Yet, as the great fleet prepared to depart, a figure appeared upon the docks of Romena. Tall he was, and fair to look upon, with hair like burnished gold and eyes that seemed to hold the light of stars. His voice was as music, and his words were honey to the ears of those who heard him. "Great king," spoke the stranger, "I am Anatar, lord of gifts, and I come bearing tidings of great import. The one you seek to humble is mighty beyond your imagining, and his power grows with each passing day. Yet I offer you wisdom, if you would hear it." Some among the king's council urged caution, for they remembered the ancient warnings about fair strangers who came bearing gifts. But Ar-Pharazôn was intrigued by this noble lord who spoke with such wisdom, and he commanded that Anatar be brought before him in the great hall of Armenelos. In the golden hall of the king, beneath the light of the crystal dome that crowned the palace of Armenelos, stood the mysterious lord who called himself Anatar. His presence seemed to fill the very air with power, and his words fell like silver rain upon the ears of the assembled court. "Mighty Ar-Pharazôn," spoke Anatar, bowing low before the throne, "I come from the eastern shores with knowledge of your enemy. This Sauron is indeed terrible, possessed of arts that would make even the Eldar tremble. But I have seen his weaknesses, and I know the manner of his defeat." The king leaned forward upon his throne, his eyes bright with interest. "Speak then, Lord of Gifts. What counsel do you offer?" "March not against him with sword and spear," replied Anatar, "for his armies are beyond counting, and his servants include creatures of shadow and flame. Instead, let your wisdom be your weapon. Invite him to Númenor as a guest, under the protection of your royal word. Let him see the glory of your realm, the might of your people, and the splendor of your court. When he beholds the true power of Númenor, he will have no choice but to acknowledge your supremacy." The council murmured among themselves, for this seemed a strange counsel. Yet Anatar continued, his voice growing more persuasive with each word. "Think, great king, of the glory that would be yours, not merely to defeat this pretender in battle, but to have him kneel before your throne in willing submission. Would this not be a victory greater than any won by sword?" Ar-Pharazôn pondered these words, and they seemed wise to him. For indeed, what greater triumph could there be than to have his enemy surrender without a blow being struck? Yet there were those in the court who spoke against this plan. Chief among them, Elendil the Tall, Lord of Andunia, who had ever been a friend to the Eldar. "My king," said Elendil, "I counsel caution in this matter. The elves of Lindon have sent word that this Sauron is not to be trusted, that he is the same who served the Dark Lord in the Elder Days. To bring such a one to our sacred shores would be to invite calamity upon our people." But Anatar smiled, and his words seemed to weave a spell about the court. "Fear not, noble lords of Númenor. What harm can one man do against the might of the Star Isle? Let him come, and let him see that the power of Númenor surpasses even the might of the Valar themselves." At these words, several of the council gasped, for it seemed blasphemous to speak so of the Holy One. Yet Ar-Pharazôn felt a strange thrill at the thought, and he began to see visions of glory that surpassed even his wildest dream. The great fleet of Númenor sailed eastward with the dawn, their sails white as sea foam, and their hulls black as the deeps of the ocean. Upon the flagship, the mighty Alcarandas, stood King Ar-Pharazôn in all his glory, clad in armor that caught the light of the sun like captured fire. Behind him sailed 700 ships, each one a masterwork of Númenorian craft, bearing the flower of the island's might. Yet this was not an army sailing to war, but an embassy of power. For upon the council of Anatar, the king had chosen to summon Sauron to Númenor, rather than give battle upon the shores of Middle-earth. The very audacity of the plan had captured the imagination of the court, and even those who had counseled caution found themselves swept up in the excitement of the moment. As the fleet approached the harbor of Umbar, the watchers upon the shore beheld a sight that struck wonder into their hearts. The sea itself seemed to burn with the reflection of the golden sail, and the air thrummed with the sound of countless oars beating in perfect rhythm. Never had such a fleet been seen upon the waters of Middle-earth since the days of the downfall of Gondolin. From the great fortress of Umbar, built in the shape of a star to mirror the island of Númenor itself, the king's heralds were sent forth into Middle-earth. They bore with them a message written in letters of gold upon parchment, made from the hide of the great sea beasts of the Western Ocean, to Sauron, who names himself King of Men and Lord of the Earth. The message read, "Greeting from Ar-Pharazôn, the Golden, 24th King of Númenor, Lord of the Westerness, and rightful ruler of all the lands beneath the sky. Know that we have heard of your claims and your deeds, and we summon you to appear before our throne in the harbor of Umbar, that we might speak with you concerning the governance of Middle-earth." The message was carried by the swiftest riders to the borders of Mordor, where the servants of Sauron received it with fear and trembling. For the power of Númenor was known even in the darkest corners of Middle-earth, and none dared to stand against the might of the Star Isle. In the Tower of Barad-dûr, Sauron himself read the summons, and his eyes blazed with a fire that had not been seen since the elder day. Yet after a time, his anger gave way to cruel laughter, for he saw in this invitation an opportunity greater than any victory he might win upon the field of battle. 7 days after the message had been sent, the watchers upon the walls of Umbar beheld a sight that filled them with amazement and dread. From the east came a great host, dark and terrible, like a storm cloud rolling across the plains of Middle-earth. At its head rode a figure of such majesty and power that even the seasoned warriors of Númenor felt their hearts quail within them. This was Sauron, the Dark Lord, come to answer the summons of the king. Yet he came not as a conqueror, but as one who seeks audience with his better. His host was mighty beyond measure, yet their weapons were sheathed, their banners furled, and their steps measured as those of men who come in peace. The Dark Lord himself was fair to look upon, for he had taken the form that men called Anatar, Lord of Gifts. Tall he was, and noble in bearing, with hair like burnished gold, and eyes that held the light of stars. Upon his brow was a circlet of silver, and his robes were of the finest silk, worked with patterns that seemed to shift and change in the light. As he approached the gates of Umbar, King Ar-Pharazôn came forth to meet him, clad in his royal armor and bearing the scepter of his fathers. Behind him came the greatest lords of Númenor, their faces stern and proud, their hands resting upon the hilts of their swords. "So," spoke the king, his voice carrying across the plain, "you are the one who dares to claim dominion over the lands that are rightfully mine." Sauron smiled, and his voice was like music as he replied, "Great King of Númenor, I come not to contest your claim, but to acknowledge it. Long have I heard tales of your wisdom and might, and I see now that they fell far short of the truth. Behold, I lay down my arms before you, and I place myself and all my realm at your disposal." With these words, the Dark Lord knelt upon the ground and bowed his head before the King of Númenor. His great host followed his example, and the plain before Umbar was filled with the sound of armor clashing as 10,000 warriors knelt in submission. The lords of Númenor looked upon this scene with wonder and triumph, for never had they imagined that victory could be won so easily. Yet there were those among them who felt a chill of foreboding, for they remembered the warnings of Gil-galad and the words of Elendil the Tall. But Ar-Pharazôn was filled with pride and joy, for it seemed to him that he had achieved the greatest victory in the history of Númenor. "Rise, Sauron of Middle-earth," he commanded, "and let us speak as kings together, for I see that you are wise enough to recognize the true order of the world." The journey from Umbar to Númenor took 7 days, and never had the great sea borne such a cargo. In the hold of the flagship Alcaronda, surrounded by the greatest treasures of the king's hoard, sat Sauron the Dark Lord, now calling himself prisoner, yet seeming more like an honored guest. His chains were wrought of the finest gold, and his cell was furnished with silk and ivory. Yet his eyes held depths that no mortal man could fathom. As the fleet sailed westward, the crew began to whisper among themselves of strange happenings. The very wind seemed to blow at the Dark Lord's command, filling their sails with unnatural swiftness. The seabirds that followed the ships sang songs that no man had heard before, and the dolphins that played in the wake of the vessels seemed to dance to a rhythm that was not of this world. Captain Siriahur, master of the Alcarondas and greatest of the sea lords of Númenor, came to King Ar-Pharazôn as they sailed through the waters of the Straight Road. "My lord," he said, his voice troubled, "I have sailed these waters for 40 years, yet never have I seen such things as I see now. The very stars seem to wheel differently in the sky, and the compass spins as though it knows not which way lies home." But the king's heart was filled with triumph, and he paid no heed to such warnings. "Fear not, good Siriahur," he replied. "These are merely the signs of our great victory. When word spreads that Sauron himself kneels before the throne of Númenor, all the world will know that we are the masters of Middle-earth." In his golden prison, Sauron smiled as he heard these words, for he had seen into the heart of the king. and he knew that pride would be his undoing. Already, plans were forming in his mind, plans that would bring about the downfall of the Star Isle and the fulfillment of prophecies that had been spoken in the darkness of Mordor. As the seventh day dawned, the peaks of Númenor rose from the western ocean like the towers of a city built by gods. The Meneltarma stood proud and tall in the center of the island, its peak wreathed in clouds, while the harbors of Romena spread out like jewels upon the eastern shore. The sight of their homeland filled the hearts of the Númenorians with joy and pride. Yet there were those who felt a shadow had fallen upon the beauty of the Star Isle. The ships entered the harbor of Romena with great ceremony, their crews singing the ancient songs of homecoming. From every tower and wall flew the banners of Númenor, and the people lined the shores to welcome their victorious king. Yet as the gangplank was lowered from the Alcarandas and Sauron set foot upon the sacred soil of Númenor, the very stones seemed to tremble beneath his feet. In the great hall of Armenelos, beneath the crystal dome that caught the light of the sun and scattered it like fallen stars, Sauron stood before the throne of Ar-Pharazôn. His chains had been removed, for what need was there of bonds when the Dark Lord had given his word of submission? Yet those who looked upon him with eyes of wisdom saw that he seemed less a prisoner than a king holding court in another's hall. "Mighty Ar-Pharazôn," spoke Sauron, his voice like honey poured over steel, "I have come to offer you not merely my submission, but my counsel. For I have walked the roads of Middle-earth for many years, and I have learned secrets that even the Eldar have forgotten. If you would but listen, I could help you to achieve glories that would make the deeds of your ancestors seem as shadow before the sun." The king leaned forward upon his throne, his eyes bright with curiosity. "Speak then, Lord of the East. What wisdom do you offer?" "I speak of the secret of immortality," replied Sauron, and at these words, the very air in the hall seemed to grow still. "Long have the Númenorians lived compared to other men, yet still do you grow old and die while the elves remain forever young. But this need not be so. There are powers in this world that could grant you life eternal, if you but have the courage to seize them." The lords of the court murmured among themselves, for this was a subject that had long troubled the minds of the Númenorians. Ever had they envied the elves their deathless lives, and ever had they sought ways to extend their own years upon the earth. But Elendil the Tall rose from his place among the council, his face grave with concern. "My king," he said, "I counsel caution in this matter. The Valar have set the bounds of mortal life, and it is not for us to transgress them. The elves are deathless because they were made so from the beginning. But we are men, and our fate is different." Sauron turned his gaze upon Elendil, and for a moment the mask of fair appearance seemed to slip, revealing depths of malice that made even the brave Lord of Andunia step back. "You speak of the Valar," said the Dark Lord, his voice now edged with steel. "But what have they ever done for Númenor, save to set limits upon your power? They gave you this island, true, but they forbade you to sail west to the undying land. They granted you long life, but they would not grant you immortality. Are you to be forever their servant, or will you claim the dominion that is rightfully yours?" These words struck deep into the heart of Ar-Pharazôn, for he had long chafed under the restrictions placed upon his people. The ban of the Valar, which forbade the Númenorians from sailing to the undying lands, had always seemed to him a cruel limitation upon their freedom. "Tell me more of this immortality," commanded the king, and Sauron smiled, for he knew that the first seed of corruption had been planted. As the months passed, the influence of Sauron grew strong in the court of Ar-Pharazôn. Day by day, he whispered poison into the ears of the king and his counselors, speaking of the jealousy of the Valar and the bondage in which they held the Númenorians. His words were like a slow poison, working their way through the halls of power until even the wisest began to question the old ways. "The Valar fear you," Sauron would say, his voice soft and persuasive. "They know that if the Númenorians were to achieve their full potential, They would surpass even the Eldar in glory. That is why they have forbidden you the undying lands, why they have set limits upon your life. They would keep you forever as their subjects, never allowing you to claim the dominion that is rightfully yours. Under his counsel, the king began to change the laws of Númenor. The ancient tongue of the elves was forbidden in the court, and the names of the Valar were no longer spoken with reverence. The white tree of Númenor, gift of the Eldar, began to wither and fail, its leaves turning brown and falling to the ground like tears. But the greatest change came when Sauron proposed the building of a great temple. "Let there be a place of worship," he said, "where the true power of Númenor might be celebrated. Not the distant Valar, who care nothing for your people, but the force that gives life to all things, the fire that burns in the hearts of the mighty." The temple was built upon the slopes of the Meneltarma, in defiance of the ancient law that forbade any building upon the holy mountain. It was a structure of black stone, shaped like a great pyramid, with a summit that reached toward the sky like a grasping hand. At its peak burned a flame that gave off no warmth, a cold fire that seemed to devour the very light around it. Within the temple, dark rites were performed that had not been seen since the days of Morgoth. The king himself became the chief priest of this new religion, offering sacrifices to the flame that burned without heat. At first, only beasts were slain upon the altar, but as the months passed, the sacrifices grew more terrible until even men who opposed the new ways were brought to feed the hungry fire. Elendil the Tall, seeing the corruption that had taken hold of his beloved homeland, gathered about him those who remained faithful to the old ways. In secret, they met in the halls of Andunia, planning how they might preserve some remnant of the true Númenor against the darkness that was coming. "We must prepare ships," said Elendil to his son Isildur, "and gather those who will still hear the voice of wisdom. For I fear that the doom of Númenor is at hand, and only by flight can we hope to preserve something of our people's glory." In the garden of the king's palace, the white tree of Númenor stood dying. Its ancient bark had turned black, its leaves fell like snow in an endless winter, and its once proud branches drooped toward the earth, as though in mourning. Yet there was one who still tended it, with love and care, despite the mockery of the court and the dangers that such devotion might bring. Isildur, son of Elendil, would come each day to water the tree's roots and speak to it words of comfort, as though it were a living friend who could understand his grief. For in the withering of the white tree, he saw the dying of all that was good and noble in Númenor, and his heart was heavy with sorrow. "Father," he said to Elendil one evening, as they walked together in the shadows of the palace gardens, "I have heard dark rumors from the temple. They say that the king plans to make a sacrifice of such magnitude that it will shake the very foundations of the world. What if he means to offer the tree itself to the flame?" Elendil's face grew grave at these words, for he knew that the destruction of the white tree would be a sign that the last hope of Númenor had died. "Then we must act," he replied. "For if the tree dies, all that we have loved will die with it." That very night, under cover of darkness, Isildur crept into the palace gardens. The guards had been withdrawn, for who would dare to approach the cursed tree that the king had marked for destruction? Working quickly and silently, he took a cutting from one of the few branches that still bore green leaves, wrapping it carefully in cloth, blessed by the elves of Lindon. As he prepared to leave, a voice spoke from the shadows, and Isildur's heart nearly stopped with fear. So the son of Elendil thinks to defy the will of the king. But when he turned, he saw not a guard or a spy, but a figure robed in white, whose face seemed to shine with its own inner light. This was Tarmiriel, the rightful queen of Númenor, who had been set aside when Ar-Pharazôn had claimed the throne by force. "Fear not, young prince," she said, her voice like music in the darkness. "I too have come to bid farewell to the tree of our fathers. Long have I watched over it in secret, hoping against hope that it might yet recover. But I see now that its fate is sealed, as is the fate of all Númenor." Together, they stood before the dying tree, And Miriel spoke words of blessing over the cutting that Isildur had taken. "Let this be a sign of hope," she said, "that even when the darkness falls, the light will endure. Take this to your father, and tell him that the Queen of Númenor has not forgotten her duty to her people." As dawn broke over the palace of Armenelos, the guards came to cut down the white tree, but they found only a withered stump, for in the night, the tree had completed its dying, its last breath of life passing into the cutting that Isildur bore away. The corruption of Númenor had proceeded apace, until the very air of the island seemed thick with malice and despair. The temple of Sauron blazed with unholy fire, and the screams of the sacrificed echoed from its dark walls. The king himself had grown terrible to behold, his face gaunt and his eyes burning with an inner flame that spoke of madness. Yet it was not enough for Ar-Pharazôn to rule over Númenor alone. The whispers of Sauron had poisoned his mind with visions of ultimate power, and he began to plan for the greatest act of rebellion in the history of Arda. "Why should we bow to the Valar?" the king declared to his assembled court. "Are we not mightier than they? Have we not mastered the sea and the earth? Let us sail to the undying land and claim our rightful place among the immortals." At these words, even the most corrupted of the courtiers felt a chill of fear, for the ban of the Valar was ancient and terrible, and none who had challenged it had ever returned. But Sauron smiled, for this was the moment he had been working toward since first he set foot upon the shores of Númenor. "Mighty king," he said, his voice like honey over poison, "you speak truly. The time has come to cast off the chains that have bound your people. I will prepare the way before you, and when you land upon the shores of Valinor, the Valar themselves will kneel before your throne." The preparation for this ultimate voyage took many months. Every ship in the harbors of Númenor was pressed into service, and new vessels were built with desperate haste. The army that assembled was beyond the counting of mortal mind, for Ar-Pharazôn had called to his banners not only the men of Númenor, but also the peoples of Middle-earth, who had sworn fealty to the Star Isle. Yet as the great fleet prepared to sail, there came to the king a messenger from the undying land. This was Eonwë, herald of Manwë, mightiest of the Valar, and his coming was like the dawn of a new day. His voice was as thunder, and his words shook the very foundations of the palace. "Ar-Pharazôn, king of Númenor," spoke the herald, "you have been deceived by the enemy of the world. Turn back from this path of folly, for the Valar are not your foe, but your friend. The ban was set not to limit your glory, but to preserve your life. If you persist in this madness, you will bring about the doom of all your people." But the king's heart was hardened by pride and the whispers of Sauron, and he laughed at the herald's word. "Be gone, messenger of the jealous Valar," he cried. "Tell your masters that Ar-Pharazôn the Golden comes to claim his rightful throne, and all the hosts of Númenor march behind him." The great fleet of Ar-Pharazôn sailed from the harbors of Númenor on a morning when the sun seemed to rise like a baleful eye in the eastern sky. Never before had the great sea borne such a burden of ships, their number beyond counting, their sails darkening the very horizon. At their head sailed the king himself aboard the mighty Alcarondas, his crown blazing with captured starlight, his sword drawn and pointing toward the west. Behind him followed the greatest lords of Númenor, their hearts filled with a mixture of triumph and dread. For though they had been corrupted by the lies of Sauron, they were not yet so lost as to forget the ancient warnings. Yet pride drove them forward, and the hope of immortality blinded them to the doom that awaited. As the fleet sailed westward, the very sea began to rebel against their passage. Great waves rose like mountains, and the wind howled with voices that spoke of wrath and judgment. The dolphins that had once played in the wakes of Númenorian ships now fled in terror, and the seabirds fell silent, as though the very air had become too poisonous for song. Yet still the fleet pressed on, driven by the will of the king and the dark power of Sauron. For 7 days and 7 nights they sailed, until at last They saw before them the shores of the undying lands, shining like silver in the light of the two trees of Valinor. But as the first ship touched the sacred strand, the very world shook to its foundation. The earth cracked and split, and from the depths came a voice like the roar of all the waters of the world combined. This was the voice of Ilúvatar himself, the one who had sung the world into being, and his wrath was terrible to behold. "Behold," spoke the voice, "the folly of those who would challenge the music of creation. As you have broken the ancient law, so shall you be broken. As you have defied the will of the One, so shall you be unmade." The mountains of Valinor began to rise, lifting themselves beyond the reach of mortal men. The very shape of the world was changed, and the straight road that had led to the undying lands was bent and broken. The fleet of Ar-Pharazôn was swallowed by a great chasm that opened in the sea, and the king and all his host were entombed beneath the wave, there to await the end of all things. But the doom of Númenor was not yet complete. For as the fleet perished in the waters of the west, a great wave began to rise in the east, taller than the mountain, swifter than the wind. This was the wave of the downfall, and it raced toward the Star Isle with the speed of divine wrath. Upon the Menel Tarma, the few who remained faithful to the old ways gathered in the ancient place of prayer. Led by Tarmiriel, the rightful queen, they lifted their voices in a final song of praise to the Valar, calling upon Manwë to remember the good that had once dwelt in Númenor. Yet even as they sang, the great waves struck the eastern shores of the island. The waters rose higher than the tallest towers, and the very foundations of Númenor began to crack and crumble. The Menel Tarma itself, the holy mountain that had stood since the island's making, split asunder with a sound like the breaking of the world. As the great waves swept across Númenor, carrying away the works of 3,000 years in a single moment of destruction, 9 ships fought their way through the chaos of the dying sea. These were the vessels of the faithful, led by Elendil the Tall, who had long prepared for this day of doom. Aboard the ship Elendil, the Lord of Andunia stood at the prow, his eyes fixed upon the eastern horizon where the sun still rose, though all the west had fallen into darkness. In his hands, he bore the cutting of the white tree, carefully tended through the long years of corruption, and beside him stood his sons Isildur and Anarion, their faces grim with sorrow for all that was lost. "Father," cried Isildur above the roar of the wind and wave, "what of the queen? What of those who remained faithful to the end?" Elendil's heart was heavy, for he knew that Tarmiriel and her companions had chosen to remain upon the Menel Tarma, to die with the land they had loved, rather than flee to an uncertain fate. "They have chosen the path of honor," he replied, his voice barely audible above the storm. "Let us pray that we may prove worthy of their sacrifice." Behind them, the Star Isle of Númenor sank beneath the wave, its mountains crumbling, its cities crushed beneath the weight of the sea. The great harbor of Romena, where once the white ships had danced like swans upon the water, vanished beneath the foam. The palace of Armenelos, with its crystal dome and golden halls, was swallowed by the hungry deep. Yet, as the island died, a wonder appeared in the sky. The cloud that had long crowned the peak of the Menel Tarma rose higher and higher, until it seemed to touch the very dome of heaven. And from within that cloud came a light that was not of the sun or stars, but of something beyond the circles of the world. "Look!" cried Anarion, pointing upward. "The light of the Valar shines still, though all else is darkness." Indeed, it seemed that the Valar had not forgotten the good that had once dwelt in Númenor. The light that shone from the cloud was like a beacon of hope, guiding the ships of the faithful away from the destruction and toward the shores of Middle-earth. But even as they sailed eastward, the survivors became aware of a terrible truth. For among the 9 ships that had escaped the downfall, there sailed one vessel that bore no banner of the faithful, no sign of allegiance to the old ways. This was the ship of Herimor, a lord who had seemed to oppose Sauron's influence, yet who had secured passage among the fleeing fleet through cunning words and false promise. As the leagues passed beneath their keel and the coast of Middle-earth grew larger upon the horizon, Elendil began to notice strange things about Harimore's ship. The wind seemed to favor it above all others, driving it forward with unnatural speed. The crew moved with a precision that spoke of long practice, and their eyes held a light that was not entirely human. It was Isildur who first voiced the suspicion that had been growing in many hearts. "Father," he said quietly, as they watched the mysterious vessel cutting through the waves ahead of them, "I have been observing Harimore's ship since we fled Númenor. Have you noticed that it casts no reflection in the water, and that the seabirds will not approach it?" Elendil felt a chill run through his bone, for he began to understand the true scope of Sauron's deception. The Dark Lord had not perished with Númenor, as they had hoped. Instead, he had prepared for this very moment, ensuring that he would have agents among the survivors who would carry his influence to the shores of Middle-earth. The great revelation that night, as the fleet anchored in the Bay of Belfalas, Elendil called a council of the surviving lords aboard his flagship. The moon hung low and red in the sky, and the very air seemed thick with foreboding. As they gathered in the great cabin, their faces lit by the flickering light of oil lamps, Elendil spoke the words that would change everything. "My friends," he began, his voice heavy with sorrow, "I must tell you a truth that will shake your very soul. The corruption of Númenor did not begin with the coming of Sauron to our shores. It began much earlier, in the very halls of our palace, with one who called himself Annatar, Lord of Gifts." The assembled lords looked at one another in confusion, for they remembered well the fair stranger who had first counseled the king to invite Sauron to Númenor. But Elendil continued, his words falling like hammer blows upon their hearts. Annatar and Sauron were one and the same. The Dark Lord had been among us for months before his supposed capture, working his poison into the very heart of our kingdom. The submission in Umbar, the voyage to Númenor, the corruption of the court, all of it was planned from the beginning. We were not the captors of Sauron, but his unwitting servant. The silence that followed was deafening, for in that moment, the survivors realized that their entire understanding of recent events had been false. They had not achieved a great victory over the Dark Lord. They had been the instruments of their own destruction. "But how can this be?" asked Siriahur, the sea captain, his voice barely a whisper. "We saw him bound in chain, saw him kneel before the king's throne. The chains were of his own making," replied Elendil, "and his submission was but another lie. He allowed himself to be brought to Númenor because that was always his intent, to corrupt our people from within and bring about the very downfall we have just witnessed." As the truth sank in, the lords began to understand the full magnitude of their situation. They were not just refugees from a natural disaster, but the scattered remnants of a people who had been deceived and manipulated by the greatest enemy of all free peoples. "Then what of Harimour?" asked Anarion, voicing the question that was in all their minds. If Sauron planned for the downfall, would he not also have planned for what comes after? Elendil nodded grimly. "I fear that Harimour and his followers are not what they seem. They are likely servants of the Dark Lord, sent to ensure that his influence survives even the destruction of Númenor. We must be prepared for betrayal, even among those who claim to share our fate." The council broke up in troubled silence, each lord returning to his own ship with a heavy heart, for they realized that their trials were far from over and that the shadow of Sauron would follow them even to the shores of Middle-earth. As dawn broke over the bay, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, the survivors of Númenor prepared for the final stage of their journey. They would found new kingdoms in Middle-earth. Arnor and Gondor would rise from the ashes of the Star Isle, but they would do so knowing that their enemy had survived the downfall and that the war between light and darkness would continue in the lands of their exile. Behind them, the waters of the Great Sea had closed over the ruins of Númenor, carrying down into the depths the proudest civilization that men had ever built. Yet, in the cutting of the white tree that Isildur bore, and in the faithful hearts of those who had escaped the corruption, something of the true glory of Númenor would endure. And in the years to come, when the realms of Arnor and Gondor stood as bulwarks against the darkness, men would remember the lesson of the Star Isle. that pride goeth before destruction, and that even the mightiest can fall if they forget the source of their strength. The tale of Númenor was ended, but the story of Middle-earth was just beginning. And in that story, both the glory and the folly of the Númenóreans would play their part, as the children of Ilúvatar continued their eternal struggle against the shadows of the world. Thus ends the tale of the fall of Númenor, the downfall of the Star Isle, and the great deception that brought low the mightiest kingdom of men. Let it be remembered as a warning to all who would set themselves above the music of creation, and as a testament to the enduring power of faith and hope in the darkest of time. Here ends the chronicle of the fall of Númenor, as recorded by the scribes of Gondor, in memory of the glory that was lost and the wisdom that was preserved.